And it's certainly an area, a field of endeavor that I think is worth exploring. And yet, in some ways, I'm more interested in who's doing the mapping of that particular territory. And how are they making their maps, right? If we think about the most basic unit of map making in terms of our own experience, what is that? What do we have? What do we use to make maps of reality? How do we do it? Senses. Whew. And how many do we have, and what are they?
5.
We've got 5. 6. The sixth sense. I hear metaphysical discussion coming up. Oh. We can all agree that we're familiar with the senses: visual, the eyes; auditory, the ears; kinesthetic, feeling senses; olfactory, we just experimented with that at lunch; and gustatory, right? And this is our nervous system. And what our nervous system does as a human being is that it interacts with reality. And it has sensations, right? If we look at it graphically, I will demonstrate my great artistic ability by taking a picture of this guy. Here's a human being. And if we look at this human being, he's got a visual sense, and he's got over here a big auditory sense, and down here he's got a kinesthetic sense. And just like you guys, this human being is experiencing reality. Reality we could represent as a purple blob, for lack of anything better. So our senses meet reality, and then what do we do when we have an experience of something outside our senses?
Yes.
Okay, and what do we react to? What do we react to?
Stimulus.
The stimulus. Our interpretation. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. What happens is, we have a stimulus, right? Something happens in the photic receptors of the eye, the kinesthetic senses of the finger. There's a sensation. That sensation goes up into the human biocomputer, which is about 1 kilogram of magic encased in 1/8 of an inch of eggshell, right here sitting on your shoulders. And what this does is it creates a map of reality. And then the human, us, we move through the world responding to this map of reality, right? That's what allows us to return to the correct condo tonight, right? That's what allows us to recognize our mother-in-law when we pick her up at the airport. That's what allows us to find our car in the parking lot at the mall, is the map of reality that we refer to. And that map was generated by external stimulus. Right? Now, on a very basic level, this is how it goes on. But at a deeper level, these maps of reality become really complex. Like an experience perhaps when you were 7 years old and you were on ice skates and the spotlight was on you and you had this intense experience, that emotional state goes into your map of reality too. And we have a sense, kind of a surface understanding that our beliefs are really maps of reality. Our beliefs guide us through the territory of life. We respond to the world and other people quite often based on our beliefs. Some of those are personal beliefs, some of those are cultural beliefs, right? So there's layers and layers and layers and layers to these maps. But the primary map-making tool are your senses. Your visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, gustatory. But primarily in NLP, we explore at great depth the senses, the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic senses, right? And for map-making, they're absolutely invaluable. Because if these are cloudy, obscured, dull, what kind of map do you create? A cloudy, obscured, dull map. Right? There's simply things that happen in the world that you're unable to perceive. Right? There's kind of what you could call a threshold to your perception. Right? You're only able to perceive what your senses allow you to perceive. And in a real practical sense, some examples of this, I heard a story told about Andres Segovia once, who's a great flamenco guitarist. And he was in his room in Seville, I think it was, and another guitarist, a very accomplished musician, was visiting, came into his apartments and saw Segovia's favorite guitar sitting there, right? And without asking the master, which was a faux pas to begin with, he went over and picked up the guitar, without dropping it, fortunately, and began to play some really nice riffs, some really good music. And when he finished, he sat down the guitar, he turned to Segovia, and he said, "Well, it's a very nice guitar, but I noticed that the 6th fret is slightly high, and it doesn't give the purest tone, right, on the bass strings." And Segovia said, "Yes, this is true. It makes it unique. And I noticed that even though you had trimmed your fingernails this morning, you didn't file them." Right? This guy could detect whether or not fingernails had been filed. So his auditory sensory acuity was really top-notch. If you consider some of the metaphors we were talking about this morning in terms of Polynesian navigation, and think back 1,000 years ago, these guys would be in a Hawaiian voyaging canoe, and the instrument, their navigational tool, was the body, period. That's it. They didn't have a compass and astrolabe. They didn't have a magnet, to find magnetic north. Current navigation in the ocean is you've got a little thing here, a box with a button, and you push the button, it'll locate you anywhere on the planet within 3 feet with global positioning satellites. But imagine being in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right? And you've got another 1,100 miles to sail, and you're the only tool that you have. So navigation by these folks was done with the senses. This is it. They had the senses to deal with reality, to follow a map, and to create a map to lead to a destination. So what do you suppose they used visually to navigate? Stars. Stars were they're most precise. The big star helped orient them during the day, which was the sun. It always came up in the east and gave them, directional references. But also the moon, reflection of the sun. But the star patterns at night, the constellations, right? There's the Hawaiian navigation is referred to as itak in Hawaiian. And a good navigator, I met a good navigator, as a matter of fact. His name was Sam Ka'ai, and he was the first navigator, I think he was the first navigator on the Hokulea, which was a reproduction of a Hawaiian voyaging canoe that sailed from Honolulu to Tahiti in 1983 or 84, I believe it was. And he navigated that whole journey just with his senses, nothing else, right? And he was talking about Hawaiian navigation, and a good navigator, traditional navigator, can hold something like 27 different stellar maps in their mind. Because, if you've watched the stars at night, they change, right? Because the Earth is rotating, the stars seem to move, so the constellations move. So if you're watching the horizon, a certain stellar configuration comes up. It's very easy on a boat to sail right for that star. You're very precise. But since the world changes, reality is tricky, slippery. So reality shifts, and then suddenly this constellation is moving up here, and it's much more difficult to orient to a star that's up towards the zenith, better towards the horizon. So these guys could hold 27 different precise stellar maps that were all different to know exactly what stars to navigate towards. So they had great visual acuity, right? And this is what made them good navigators. But imagine a night when it was completely foggy, right? It's dark, fog sets in, there's no moon, there's no stars. You're the navigator, what do you do? How do you keep the canoe on course? Sense of direction, exactly. But what do you use to trust it? Right? You were saying that you're beginning to trust your emotions and your intuition, right? That's a useful thing to do if you have the evidence of it being trustworthy, right? If we look at a Hawaiian navigator, they trusted their intuitions, but they used their senses to educate their intuition in very precise ways. Wind. And how would you use the wind if you couldn't see?
By hearing?
Auditorily, yeah, you can pick up a lot of information, right? The last time you knew you were on course, if you were calibrating to or kind of indexing the direction of the wind and the position of the sail, and the wind is striking this part of your face perhaps, right, and blowing little tassels in certain ways, to stay on the same course, you'd want the wind in the same configuration. And that could be partly short-range visual, but it could also be auditory. But what happens if the wind changes directions 3 or 4 times or a couple of squalls come back in, and you're not sure whether you're calibrating to the appropriate wind direction or whether it's changed? Then what do you do? And how do you use the waves? Technology. How do you use the waves?
What do you feel with the movement of the boats?
That's precisely it. A good navigator, traditional navigator, when all else failed, no visual, right? The wind, feel, unable to be perceived, would go into a trance and lay down in the back of the boat while they still knew they were on the right course. And what they would do is they would register the movement of the waves in their body, literally in the fluid of their body, because your body can pick up all of that stuff internally. And they'd be in a trance, and this would be a compass. And they would have one hand raised as they lay down. And if the canoe got off course and the body feeling changed, it was very specific. If it changed, they would give the guy on the tiller a hand direction, and he would move it this way, or the sail would be set, until the body felt exactly the same again. Right? So you're talking about a 360-degree kinesthetic reference in the body to navigate a canoe. And again, at times you could have the responsibility for 35 people and kids and grandma and grandpa. So these folks who developed this kind of cartography and exploring the territory to create their maps were very precise in the use of their senses. And in fact, that's what enables you to make maps of reality that have the current date as copyright as opposed to 1928. Now, Brian, you were saying you're an acupuncturist, right? Do you do other types of Chinese medicine? Herbal? Have you ever gotten into oriental pulses as a diagnostic?
Yes.
So if I gave you my wrist, how many different pulses could you?
There's 6 on each side.
6 on each side. All right. So Brian has with his fingers, kinesthetically, he can detect 6 different pulses in my wrists and diagnose certain energetic flows in my body based on those pulses. Now, if I'm lucky, I could pick up Ricardo's wrist and go, "Yep, he's still alive." He's still ticking. So Brian is, through this kind of diligent study, has developed a kinesthetic skill. And those of you in here who are body workers have enhanced this. We've all tended to enhance certain of our senses. Some of us are really good at reading other people, facial expressions, mannerisms, and the way they move. So we've developed our eyes. Others of us who are musicians, there are a number of folks when we were introducing ourselves who play musical instruments, etc., are in the Segovia category. They can detect a lot of auditory differences. Right? So our life experiences tends to allow us to amplify preference to one. We call these in NLP, our senses, we call them representational systems. Right? Visual, auditory, kinesthetic representational systems, because we use those senses to represent reality. So they're systems with which we make representations, our maps of reality. Right? But what allows us to do this, again, are our thresholds of perception. Right? I can feel 1 pulse. Brian can feel 6. So his threshold of perception, he's lowered it. So what's happened for Brian is he has an inflow of what we call in NLP news of difference. In other words, there's a lot of information he's picking up here, and I'm not picking up much because my threshold's way up here. But as the senses become more finely tuned, the thresholds of perception lower. And literally, the world changes. Right? People's wrists aren't the same thing to you now as they were 5 years or 10 years ago. Right? There's a totally different perception. And a musician knows this. I mean, we all know this about various things in our lives, the things that we really have tuned our senses to. So when we begin an NLP practitioner training, we begin with what is, in a sense, the most basic and the most important. the instrument with which not only do you make your maps of reality, but the instrument with which you'll be changing your maps of reality over the course of the next 5, 10, 20 days, right? Which is your nervous system. It goes back to a kind of a classic quote from one of the, what would you call him? Not really a grandfather of NLP. He's more like a mentor to the world of NLP, a gentleman named Gregory Bateson. Some of you may have read Bateson's works. He's written a number of things. He wrote a really important book called Mind and Nature, and in it is the following quote. He says that the argument of this book presupposes that science is a way of perceiving and making what we may call sense of our percepts. Right? So science perceives and it makes sense of things. But perception operates only upon difference. It's like the wrist. My sensory acuity or my sensory awareness, the threshold of it, is only able to detect one pulse. Right? If I lower the threshold, I can make greater distinctions and have greater news of difference, as Bateson calls it. All receipt of information is necessarily the receipt of news of difference, and all perception of difference is limited by threshold. Differences that are too slight or too slowly presented are not perceivable. So in my experience, the pulses in the wrist are too slight. I haven't tuned my nervous system. Brian has. For him, they're not too slight. He can perceive them. Right? So for me, they're not food for perception. I am totally unconscious of them. It follows that what we can perceive is always limited by threshold. That is, what is subliminal will not be grist for our mill. Knowledge at any given moment will be a function of the thresholds of our available means of perception. Do that one again. Knowledge at any given moment will be a function of the thresholds of our available means of perception. Right? That absolutely determines your level of knowledge, is your ability to make sensory distinctions. Right? Gives the examples that the invention of the microscope or the telescope disclosed what was utterly unpredictable from the levels of perception that were achieved before that discovery. So you think about what world the microscope or the telescope permitted you to perceive. Now we have the Hubble Space Telescope and electron scanning microscopes that reveal worlds that we were totally unconscious of. We had no idea they even existed. The same thing, exactly the same thing, is true of your nervous system. There are worlds that exist that you know not of. Right? Simply because those thresholds of perception have yet to be lowered. And sensory acuity is how we call this in NLP, how we refer to this, sensory awareness, these thresholds of perception. And sensory acuity is something that is going to begin today and it's going to continue forever, right, Adrian? I'm still practicing it. Right? And I've been doing this 20-some years. To tune. That's exactly right. Relax, this isn't 1 and 1 is 2 and it's always going to be 2, right? This is a threshold of perception that you can literally continue to lower and lower and lower and lower. And each level that it drops, the more sensory awareness you have, the more the world changes. And it's sometimes difficult for, us to really understand the impact of this because we seem so familiar with seeing and hearing and feeling. Well, we just do it, right? And we tend to want to, well, what's the technique, or what's the pattern, or how do we do this, right? This is the instrument that you use to become a master of NLP. This is the instrument that you use to become a master at your relationship with your wife or your kids. This is the instrument you use in business. This is the only instrument you got. And to the degree that you're able to shift these thresholds of perception, then news of difference begins to flow in. Those maps are updated from 1928 to the current date, right? And you begin to respond to things as they are, not as they were represented years ago. Right? By virtue of a nervous system, right, that is tuned to a degree of sensory acuity. My wife and I refer to NLP as, particularly the practitioner training, as a strategy for cleaning the instrument of the body-mind. Because what you take into life is your body-mind. That's what you've got. And if the instrument, just like the lens on a camera or a microscope, is smudged and greasy, right? The perceptions are limited. But if the instrument itself is clean, the instrument of the body-mind, then the world is a remarkably different place. So some of the things that we do for the rest of the afternoon on the surface are going to seem really kind of silly because they're so simple. But this is almost an Oriental kind of Zen thing, you know. It's like, well, God, it can't be that simple. It is one of those things that it absolutely is that simple. That to the degree that you can educate your nervous system, it's going to be one of the absolute fundamental indicators of your proficiency as an NLP practitioner. And I say that it looks silly because of the following reason. Dana and Ricardo, could you guys slide your chairs up here for just a moment? And I'll slide this chair over and join you. Facing me, let's see, if you guys are, yeah, you guys, let's see. We'll have Dana be the detector. So Dana, you want to sit in this chair, if you would. All right, Ricardo's going to sit there, and I'm going to sit here. And what we're going to do is we're going to afford Dana the opportunity to lower the thresholds of perception in exactly the channel that she was saying earlier she'd like a little tune-up with or a little exploration of, which is the auditory system. Right? And we're going to do it in the following way. In a moment, Ricardo's going to make a sound, and I'm going to make the same sound. But since Ricardo's Ricardo and I'm Tom, there's no way I can make the same sound. Right? There's going to be differences. And Dana's task is to identify what those differences are. Right? Now, when we do this, what we're doing is we're assuming that right now Dana's thresholds of perception auditorily are at a certain set point. She's able to make certain elemental distinctions auditorily. And our task is to lower that threshold so she can make more and clearer perceptions and receive more news of difference by virtue of that. Right? Now, as we do this, we want to make sure that she's sort of constantly in a state of challenge, right? So let's snap your fingers there for a minute, okay? One more time. Okay, we'll try this to begin with. Now these are two sounds. Ricardo's making one, I'm making another. All right, what we're going to do is let Dana hear and listen to both, so she's going to be hearing them, and then she's going to be indexing the sound to the person that made it. In NLP we call this calibrating. So Ricardo's going to snap his fingers 3 or 4 times. She's going to calibrate to Ricardo so she knows that that sound goes with Ricardo. Then I'll do the same thing and she'll calibrate to me. So what you need to do, since it would be a little bit easier to know who's doing the finger snapping with your eyes open, is close your eyes. Yeah, right now. Now Ricardo's going to snap his fingers and then say his name.
Ricardo. 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 Ricardo.
Got it, Dana? Okay, now I'll do the same. Tom, Tom, Tom. Got it? All right, now is there any doubt at all?
I don't know.
Yeah, and why's that?
Because you said your name's after.
She's good. Boy, I thought this was going to be hard. All right, so here's how we're going to work that. In a moment, with your eyes closed, we're going to randomly, one or the other, we're not going to tell you who, they're going to make a snap of the finger, and your task is to guess, based on your calibration, who it is, right? If you guess correctly, the person who did it will say correct. If you guess incorrectly, they'll say no and give you their name. All right, so you can update your map. All right, so we're going to begin. You ready?
Tom.
Correct.
Tom.
No.
It's Ricardo. Okay?
Ricardo.
Correct.
Tom.
Correct.
Ricardo.
Correct.
Tom.
Correct. Okay, now that's about 4 in a row. So she's got it made. In other words, she knows the distinction quite well. So what's happening, there's no news of difference coming in. There's no stretch to her auditory receptors. And the reason for that is because these two sound stimuluses are sufficiently dissimilar that you can pretty much easily detect the difference. So now what we want to do is make them more similar. All right, so we'll continue, and we'll begin again.
You know, I was using location.
Wow.
I can locate where they were.
And this is the kind of thing that your detector, your pattern detector, wants to be aware of. What are they using to make the distinctions? Because location is only one possibility auditorily. There's lots of other possibilities that you can discover. So now that we know that she's doing that, we're certainly not going to do it again, are we? All right, so, are you ready to roll again? Ready, Dana?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Tom.
Correct.
Ricardo.
Correct.
Ricardo.
Tom.
Ooh, you were stopped.
Right. So now we know that she's using another, these are called submodalities. You got the modality, the representational system, auditory, then the subcomponents, one of which is location, also volume, right? So, let's carry on.
Ricardo.
Correct.
Ricardo.
Tom. Right.
Tom.
Ricardo. All right. Now we're at the other end of the range. We're at the range where pretty much regularly she's not getting them correctly. That means that she's not learning anything. It's just random. Could be one thing, could be the other, right?
Okay, I guess I go home.
Right. Oh, we're doing so good just a moment ago. So now what we want to do is make the sound a little bit more dissimilar so she can detect the pattern. In other words, we're not trying to make sure that she never gets it right. What we're trying to do is stretch her awareness. So in terms of this exercise, where you want your pattern detector to be is at about 70% correct, maybe 75, something like that. If they're getting them all right or all wrong, nothing is happening. There's no news of difference. They're not really calibrating to any distinctions of significance. So we'll carry on just a bit more, okay, Dana?
Ricardo.
Very good. All right.
Tom.
Correct?
Tom.
Ricardo.
Tom.
That was Ricardo. Okay? Now, just to...
Well,
I'm sorry. It was? Well, where was I? Correct. Exactly. Let me offer a brief recommendation that if you start to process the stimulus for too long, right? What do you start doing? What were you doing when you heard them and then there was a pause before you made your decision? What were you doing inside?
I was trying to figure out who's that.
Right, and how were you doing that when you say you were trying?
Well, you know, how was I doing it? Usually Tom is louder than Ricardo, but they change that occasionally.
Right.
So what are the chances they've changed it this time?
Right. So in a sense, what she's saying is the first thing that she's done, right, is she's gone to internal dialogue. So now she's talking to herself. So that whole external awareness of the auditory is completely gone. The longer and the more she talks, the further away she is from the explicit stimulus itself. So just as kind of a guideline on how to begin to get to be really good at this, you want to go with whatever your first impression is. Just the quicker. Speed is important. It can be really important. You start trusting your senses rather than having the mind figure it out. Because if you've processed this information for more than maybe 2 seconds, it's like flipping a coin because you're so far removed from the stimulus. Okay? If at any point during this little round here, your pattern detector is perhaps losing the calibration, it's fine to stop and recalibrate. Okay? So we could do that again, and we'll give you Ricardo a couple times. Go ahead.
Ricardo. Ricardo. Ricardo.
Okay? And then Tom, Tom, Tom. All right.
You guys are in the same location, aren't you?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay? So you want to have your guess really quick.
Okay. guess right now?
Yeah. That's quick, yes.
Ricardo.
Very good. Okay, ready?
Tom.
Correct?
Tom.
Ricardo.
Ricardo.
Tom.
Tom.
Correct.
Ricardo.
Correct.
Tom.
Correct.
Ricardo.
Correct.
Ricardo.
Tom.
Tom.
Ricardo.
Tom.
Ricardo.
Ricardo.
Correct.
Ricardo.
Tom.
Tom.
Ricardo. Okay, so now what we're getting to be aware of is that location is the one that she's using the most. So what we want to do, right, to kind of eliminate that one is start producing these from the same location. Right? So carry on just real briefly. Go ahead.
Tom.
That was Ricardo. Sorry.
Tom.
Ricardo.
Ricardo.
Correct.
Ricardo.
Tom.
Tom.
Ricardo.
Ricardo.
Correct.
Ricardo.
Correct.
Tom.
Correct.
Ricardo.
Correct. Very good. Now that one was particularly good because his volume matched mine, the location, and there was just an instant of hesitation and boom, she blurted it out. Right? So, well done, Dana. Way to go. Absolutely. Thank you both for letting us lower some thresholds here. Slide those guys back. All righty. This is going to be the first little round with two partners. There are going to be two pattern generators and one pattern detector. Okay? And again, so the guidelines for this are, your intention as the pattern, finger snappers, is to lower this person's threshold of perception by stretching this sense. If they're getting them all correct, there's no news of difference. If they're getting them all wrong, there's no news of difference. You want them to be getting correct guesses at about 75% of the time. So there's lots of different sounds you can use. Finger snaps is just one. You can rub your hands together, right? You can make a tapping sound, part of the body. You can make up a sound, crumple up some paper. Anything that you can reproduce is pretty much the same, one person to the other, right? And then what we'll do is we'll do a 5-minute round per person. So as we're doing this, and it gets faster once you kind of get streamlined, we'll start, Dana would be doing this for 5 minutes, so we'd switch, and then Dana and I would be generating, Ricardo would be guessing, and finally I'd be guessing. So it's kind of a round robin, 5 minutes each. Okay? Any questions about this? Yeah? You can give it a shot. You can give it, mba, or whatever you'd like, right? As long as they're close enough to make it a challenge to know which one, and different enough that they are perceiving news of difference, right? Now, a couple of guidelines again. If you're the guesser, do it quickly, right? Because if you don't, and you get lost in internal dialogue, you start making pictures of one guy's hand and the other girl's hand, or whatever it is, this removes you from the stimulus, and then it becomes a 50-50 chance. Yeah, Eli.
At the university, when I was writing, they said that first it was accepted that the first thing yes is correct, but then statistically they find out that actually it's not. So I was just wondering which one.
Well, if you'd like to explore that, you can try it both ways,
Yeah.
and then you'll have the answer for yourself. All right, any other questions about this?
Changing the location of the sounds as well?
You can do that. We were doing that initially, but it was obvious from the beginning that Dana could get the location pretty easily. So then we brought it closer together to make that more of a challenge, and she primarily was calibrating to volume, right? So also be aware of what kind of distinctions are you picking up. Are you really good at detecting auditory location? Are you better at things like sort of auditory volume, right? Anything that you notice in the auditory field. Okay, so when we break for these small exercises, we've got the outside. There's an area, a little patio area over here. You can do this seated or standing. Doesn't make any difference. You can arrange your chairs any way you want in the room. In about 20 minutes or so, when we get together as a whole group, just reset the chairs with respect to these little blue lines, and we'll be in business. All right? Find two partners and lower the thresholds of perception of their auditory representational system. You rotate. Keep the same 3 people. Right. 5 minutes each. This is called Fun with Your Ears, right? I hope you all had some. What did you discover in this exercise? Challenging in what way?
Try to maybe get from figure frequencies, notion, and then you're trying to switch it or.
Right. So, I mean, this is the point of this whole thing. We're talking about lowering thresholds of perception. Hopefully you all experienced it as a challenge. My question to you is, what were you doing inside to meet the challenge? All right, so some of you were using different senses, right?
It didn't work, I used different.
Okay, so you'd shift to try to move from auditory to a visual and get a picture of their hands or something?
Something like that.
All right.
The feeling of like his hand was larger and his hand was smaller.
Okay, all right. Intuition, interesting. Yeah, and what was that like? I mean, how do you know, Monet, when you're using intuition? How do you know that?
Why not just pretty much failure?
That's
It felt like it was right and then it was wrong.
You use of? Okay.
Musical.
So
It was like the two instruments for me. When they did calibration, I imagined that they are different instruments.
Okay.
And when they started an exercise, I was like completely, I could do that.
Gotcha.
Because there are different instruments.
All right. So some of you, just based on life experience, like in this case, she sort of indexed different kinds of instruments, and she used that as her sort of strategy for calibrating. No, the sound of the instrument.
The sound.
Yeah. Versus bassoon.
Could you differentiate between different
intensity of the sound and still tell the
They
difference?
can tell you, so it's almost 90%.
It's good.
So, yeah, because sometimes even the same person, but he doesn't produce exactly
The same sound.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a challenge. Right? Exactly. So for her, what I'm suggesting is that given her life experience, she has developed a really useful strategy for making auditory distinctions. So one of the things as we progress in the training, you'll have the skill to be able to do is to model other people's behavior and figure out exactly how she does it. So if there are those of you who it was difficult making these distinctions, right, she'd be a good resource to approach so that you can continue to tune in to what's happening. Right? Yeah, Eva.
Also use kinesthetic a couple of times, accidentally or intuitively using sort of catchy sounds. I said the wrong thing, but my finger pointed at the right place.
Okay, so you consciously were unsure, but unconsciously you knew. Right, interesting. Yeah, all right. So, yeah. Well,
Sounds like a clap has a lot more variation, so it's a little bit more difficult when there's nothing.
right. So some sounds themselves are actually richer, like a big hand clap has got more richness to it or more variables than a simple finger snap.
You can
Yeah.
almost feel vibrations from it.
Right.
You're not only listening to it, like,
So it's almost a kinesthetic flow as well. So all of the senses are engaged. Now, how many of you noticed that if you weren't sure, that you did something else? You started talking to yourself or trying, I wonder who it was, or was that him again, right? Does that sound familiar, Brent? Right? And then, literally, it's just, you're flipping a coin. You have no idea. You're so far from the stimulus. So whether it's correct or incorrect, the quicker it is, right? Is that, because you had a question about that in terms of scientific research indicates that...
Well, yeah, my first guess was 90% correct.
First guess, 90% correct. Okay, this is from a man who has explored it from both directions, from the literature and from personal experience. And personal experience is the final arbiter of your reality, regardless of what you read.
I knew that my textbook was.
Yeah. Well, now you can see those guys who wrote the textbook don't know what the heck they're talking about.
but is it a fair challenge if they're so good at mimicking each other, if their purpose is to trick you?
No, then you have two people that I'd like to talk to after the training. No, yeah, exactly. The intent of this is not to make it difficult to guess, because if you do that, you're cheating your partner of learning. Right? Absolutely, you're withholding learning. The strategy in this is to stretch their perceptions so they're getting 75% of these right. I mean, it's possible that if you have really some impairment or bad sensory acuity auditorily, some person could be over here going, Bill, and somebody could be over here going, Joe, just so you can make the distinctions. So it's not about it being that kind of a challenge where you fail. You should be challenging your partners by allowing them to succeed, but only 75% of the time. Because it's in that other 25% where the learning occurs, where they're actually stretching themselves. Because it's hard to put your words to it or specific experience and explain it. But you're doing something really unique when you're meeting the challenge of auditory acuity. You're literally using your brain in a different way. Your awareness is in the ears and to the sensory perceptions coming in. Right? The effect of that is that it begins to lower your thresholds of perception auditorily. Now, as we're going to do all three systems, visual, kinesthetic next, right? And what you'll notice during the course of this is that you tend to have preferences for one system or another. In other words, some of you are going to be really good auditorily. You got a background in music. Some of you may be really, really good visually. Some of you are going to be very, very good kinesthetically. So as you go through all three rounds, I want you to be aware of which one of these seems to be the easiest or the ones that you have, the lower thresholds in. All right, so to do the kinesthetic calibration, Ken and Amal, would you be willing to just sort of slide your chairs over here and we'll play another little game with the kinesthetic system. And essentially the format of the structure of it is the same. And, okay, Kim, why don't you have a seat here? I'll sit in that one for a minute. You'll be the detector. All right, so now we're gonna challenge, Amal and I are going to challenge Ken's kinesthetic senses. So if it's okay with you, we're going to touch your knees, okay?
I'd like to.
Oh, there's that. I got a whole month of this. Cool. All right, now, if I use the left knee and Amal uses I use the right knee and Amal uses the left knee, is that going to teach him much? Why? Location, right? So we want to use the same knee. And so let's use this knee. All right, so you'll go first, and let's use 3 fingers, right? And you're going to touch him on the knee 3 separate times and say your name after each one, and you're going to calibrate to her touch. And after you touch him, say your name so he knows who's who.
Okay. Amal.
Okay, and here's Tom. Tom. You got it?
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to randomly and then you guess.
Tom.
Correct.
Uh-oh. Okay, do that one again. Tom.
No, you
Amal.
right.
Tom.
Amal. Oh.
Yeah, we want to change the world.
That wasn't my name.
Yeah, that was my name.
Okay.
Close it.
I need you guys to recalibrate.
Okay, great. And then he knows. Because you'll do this and you may have done it auditorily where it's just gone. It's random. I don't know.
Yeah.
In which case you need to recalibrate, to reset the system. So now we'll do it again. So go ahead and you.
Amal.
Okay. Tom.
Okay. Amal.
Tom. Correct.
Amal.
Correct.
Tom.
Correct.
Amal.
Correct.
Tom.
Correct.
Correct.
Amal.
Correct.
Tom.
Correct.
I'm all.
Tom.
Tom.
Correct.
I'm all.
Correct.
Tom.
Correct. Wow, okay, so he's getting pretty good, right? Now, when this is the case, what we need to do is to make the stimulus closer together so it's more of a challenge. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop back to 2 fingers, okay? And we'll go ahead and use the other knee, all right? So it's got kind of fresh senses there.
Do you apply pressure when you touch?
Yeah, now here's what I'm doing to be as close, I wanted to be different from her. So when she was first touching, she had 3 fingers, and what did you notice about the differences? How did you detect them?
In the beginning, hers was soft, and after that, they weren't.
Right.
So when I calibrated to hers in the beginning, after that, it wasn't the same. But his pushed straight down and firm, and hers was soft and kind of forward.
Okay.
And then, a couple times you kind of touched with your finger,
Right.
while 2 of them were up here.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got confused because she did that too.
Okay.
And then I started realizing there was kind of an approach where every time his was kind of the same and hers was kind of a little bit different.
Gotcha.
Not only that, but I was peeking.
So these are subsets of the kinesthetic system. Pressure is a big one. Location is a big one kinesthetically. But also direction of movement. She kind of detected a sequence that went in there. So as we were first beginning, I wanted mine to be somewhat different. So I was doing a slightly different location and a slightly different move with firmer pressure. So that, it would be, he'd be able to detect some difference. But then when he was getting them all really correct, I dropped back a bit and started matching her a little bit more directly. And he was still doing really quite well. He was doing, I couldn't reproduce this sufficiently, make it the same, to make him incorrect 25% of the time. So now we're going to decrease the stimulus to make it more of a stretch by going to 2 fingers. Instead of 3, we're going to go to 2, we're going to use this leg. Okay, so you ready to calibrate?
Okay.
All right.
I'm on.
Tom. Ready? You ready, Ken?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I'm all.
Tom.
I'm all.
Tom.
Okay.
Now we're on to something. Right? Recalibrate. Great.
I'm on. And then out of it.
Tom.
Okay. Tom.
Correct.
I'm all.
Correct.
Tom.
Correct.
I'm all.
Correct.
Tom.
Correct.
I'm all.
Correct.
I'm all.
Okay, now, what are you calibrating to?
I'm hearing.
That's right.
Okay.
All right, so what he's hearing is the movement of Amal's clothing as she leans forward, right?
Okay.
But check it out.
I was going to tell you pretty soon.
Yeah, I figured that. I'm over how long am I going to let this continue, right? So here's what people do characteristically in life. If there's a challenge to a particular representational system and they find it easy to make distinctions in another, they'll spontaneously shift to the other instead of continually challenging the original one. So you're talking about Helen Keller, right? She never stopped challenging all of them, right? I mean, that was just where she was at. Most of us, if, whatever's going auditorily, it's hard to make distinctions, but they're really easy. Visually, we can do it. We tend to rely on what's easy. Therefore, those systems that could be really enhanced, we tend not to do. So this whole thing is really a challenge to the nervous system and does stretch all of them. So what I'd like you to do is sit forward a little bit so your clothes don't make any noise, all right? And just be real cautious of any sound.
Okay.
You've already got the calibration, so close your eyes.
I may need it one more time.
Okay, we'll do it briefly. We'll give you 2 calibrations each.
Amen.
Tom.
Okay. I'm all.
Tom.
I'm all.
Tom.
Okay, you tricked me. Tom.
Correct.
I'm all.
Tom.
Okay. I'm all.
Tom.
Tom.
Amo.
Okay.
Okay, now, right. So now we've gone the other direction, and so now we want to, right, make them a little bit, sped them just a bit. So
Okay.
you want to recalibrate, or?
Yeah.
All right, so go ahead.
Aman, Amen, Amen.